The Taking of Seth. I came to Gothanani as a boy creature from the wilderness 15 years ago, long before the war had ever started, and the people were unchanged by it then. You see, I had already spent 6 months of living like an animal out in the wilderness and backcountry before meeting them one favored day. My loving father had been killed by a greedy band of slavers, and my mother had soon after that died from the plague, leaving me all alone with very little means in which to survive the harsh conditions of the western wilderness, all alone and barely reaching my 6th year of life after birth. I had been given the Christian name of Seth by my dead parents. Most everything else had been forgotten over time due to my young age. As normal recollection had been removed from my life, even my birth date had been forgotten and lost to antiquity. I can remember that perhaps my mother had told me as I was learning to speak the English language what day it fell on, but after that early time in my life, dates and events meant very little to me. I had been laying in a dugout that I had covered with branches and other foliage that had long ago been dried out from the weathered elements of time. Old articles of my mother's clothing had been piled onto the frozen earth, forming a bed in my abode for comfort, and now the garments were soiled black. It was cool in the air as I arose to the morning sunlight, finding the snow still to be very hardened and chunky from the below zero temperatures of the night before. The frosted mat of snow broke underneath my moccasin covered feet as I went walking through it. There was a trickling stream nearby that hadn't been completely frozen yet, since the cold came only months ago. Along cracks and fissures, there was fresh water still flowing underneath the top layer of ice that ultimately had sustained my life. A mist from a cloud still loitering in the valley where the creek was at, and I followed a trail that took me there to the stream. I had been very smart over the months, and it kept a hole in the sheet of ice hollowed out and open from hitting it with my walking stick. Crack! It sounded and broke again as I impelled it with the hard part of my walking cane. The water made my stomach boil as I drank it down. After piling it up into my cold hands and then into my mouth, food came into my mind, and a memory of meat shimmering in the fire pit or of my mother's apple pie shot into my brain like a charge of explosive energy that motivated me to move into the crisp air of the already harsh day. Another dead thing to eat. I dreaded to think of it all, of the frozen dead things that I had swallowed down. I can't say that I have adapted to the smell of rotting flesh because it still bothers me. Partly thawed animals, bodies found frozen in the forest floor, can make for a meal, but on colder days it might not thaw. I preferred the light of a sunny day where usually I could track in the footsteps of a coyote or of a lone wolf. They'd even share in the fresh kill if there was one. I had been learning from the canines how to survive all along. The pesky squirrels even had something to show me. It was last fall, and I can remember them chattering back and forth to one another from the forest floor. They were fighting over a stash of piñon nuts and were piling them away inside the vacated holes of many Douglas fir trees. Over the months, I even learned to climb the trees like the squirrels or the raccoons, and the piñon nut stashes or dead beetle piles sometimes provided me a tasty energy snack. It was cold in the wind as I air dried my hands in the falling air that sunk back to the ice covering over the creek. I pretended to feel no pain while squeezing my fingers together and shaking them up and down until the water cleanly dripped from them leaving a moist shell of freezing water to burn away at them. It was hard getting some water in the morning, but it was even harder to follow the wolf packs during the day as my body ached for more energy and nourishment to follow their trails. My pain from near starvation was so great that I could barely endure, and yet I found even a stranger instinct inside of me, even stronger than pain. I would not end up like the dead animals that I had been so lucky to find for food. Somehow I would survive. The night before, while I lay resting warm and snuggled inside my mother's clothing, there had been a coyote howling up on the ridge due north of my haunt. Courageously, later in the evening, he decided to come in closer to check on me to see if I had extra dead things laying around my nest, perhaps to steal them. He left with no prize because I had nothing laying outside for him, but rather coveted a frozen squirrel's body inside my shack that I kept hanging from a stick. Today I will track him, I thought. I will follow his tracks until they lead me somewhere, even to his kill. Dirty old shack, I yelled out into the valley as I began to gather a few things for the journey from my stick home. My canteen was full of water. I had my frozen squirrel that was now beginning to thaw and stinking up the place, and my buffalo hide coat. I was ready and very hungry. The old coyote had left a nice trail for me to follow because he had very large paws for the coyote. He was huge and heavy and took long strides. This revealed that he had been eating well and was a good hunter. It could also mean that he might backtrack and take me as a prey. I would have to be more careful from now on. I knew that he could easily kill me if he decided to change his hunting taste and then to turn on me. It could be quickly done if I were ambushed somewhere out in the open country. Hunger was my only real defense against such a mighty creature, which made me seem fearless to all animals, even more fearless than the lone coyote. The tree-shadowed walls of my hidden valley finally led me to a narrowing ravine, which at last revealed an awesome blue heaven. The northern skies I had been avoiding up to this date because from that region could be found the slavers' camp. Even then, I decided, in following his endless paw prints that led me onward, maybe even a clear trail to somewhere even more dangerous. The trail continued on for miles, heading due north perhaps, seeking out an elk herd, I considered, and then the prince began to meander a little back and forth as he went along, as if he were sniffing for the scent of some sort. Then at last I could see in the broken snow what his secret was. He was hunting field mice under the snow blanket while traveling along, and he had left me a fresh one. It wasn't much of a meal, but the meat would nourish me for a few more miles of traveling, and I quickly gulped it down after biting its head off with my teeth. I traveled farther until the clouds began to lightly drop snowflakes, as I grew ever more tired from sinking deep into the snowbanks that were hidden amongst the shallower levels. The coyote seemed to effortlessly channel his direction of travel over the deep troughs of snow, as if he were made of feathers, while I was made to endlessly dip into them time and time again over the long and treacherous miles that already I had traversed, until finally I became horrified when I noticed the sky above. The day was nearing an end already, and I hadn't realized it. I had forgotten to follow the trajectory of the sun with my mind because of my exhaustion from the tiring day, and now the life sustaining sunlight was beginning to steal away from me by escaping beneath the western horizon. The difficulty in traveling had taken my mind to faraway places, and it was not until I had descended down a very steep mountain ridge that I realized the passing of time. My survival depended on me finding shelter of some sort. Even a tree could provide a windbreak from the cold breezes that sometimes carried snow rifts with them. My once thawed squirrel was now frozen again as the evening started to come on, and the shadows that were earlier cast from the zenith sunlight now had began to crawl further and further, deeper underneath the high trees of the steep walled valley. I became angry at myself and threw the dead squirrel far away from me, and I cursed at it while it rolled away like a hard stick would roll end over end, making a dull, thumping sound loud enough to be heard a short distance away until its momentum expired by crashing against a hard rock that stopped its progress. I was tired of eating rotting things, and I decided that I would rather die than have to smell that same stench again, because the frozen body parts of dead things must first be brought to thaw inside one's mouth and then finally swallowed down. It was horrid, but that was the only way to get the frozen food eaten. This part of the highlands was full of heavy tree covering and dried grass foliage from the summer before. The grasses had grown very high over time on this particular side of the mountain during the warmer weather months, as the extra sunlight and moisture had brought all of the seedlings to their fullest extension of growth. And I wondered if I would ever live to see the lower parts of the green grasses that existed just underneath the current snow line. The skies were beginning to darken before my very eyes, and the wind was also picking up speed out of the north, even though it began blowing slightly at first. Still, the changing wind speeds were easy for me to notice because of the bite that it took as the cold tore into my flesh like a knife. A howling suddenly erupted not far away, sending me off scurrying to find some protection underneath a thick branched fir tree. A night had not passed since winter had come into the high country, that a fog did not seep into the region, and this night was no different from the rest as the valley began to darken with low cloud matter, and the moon could faintly be seen. Hours passed, and I began to wonder, did I smell smoke? The fog had begun to lighten up slightly, and the scent of burning wood aroused me from the sheltering umbrella that the tree provided. Then I saw it coming through the misty fog, and for sure it was the glinting sprawl of a shining light, as my eyes dare not lie to me at that time. I had taken a shallow whiff of someone's campfire and seen a light, and this was not an illusion. Surely there must be a human presence there as well, I thought. It became colder, and as I approached the dwelling place of a stranger, it could have been a band of slavers for all I cared, because there was food down there, and I could smell it cooking as I became nearer to it. Elk meat was cooking in the fire, and the sweet smell of it came pouring into my nostrils like water would flow into them. The scent of the fresh meat drew me ever closer to its source, until finally at last the forest opened up into a large clearing that had long since been swallowed up by an old wooden cabin. The weathered cabin had tolerated many years of high winds, as the clay roof revealed from the gaping holes that sent light from inside, emanating outwards. Maybe it had been lost in time, just like me, I thought. There was a glass opening through the narrow window. I could see a woman moving about. She had long, curly, blondish brown hair, reached for the floor as she moved around inside while attending to something. She was very beautiful to view from afar. By and oftentimes her lean silhouette would disappear from my sight, only to shortly reappear. It was Annie, my adoptive and loving new mother to be. It was wonderful living with her and Goth and sharing in their life. Yet I was to become a man now, and something was calling me away to another place and time. A restlessness for something more over come to me one day, so I headed for the southbound train. In the year of 1862, a freak rain befell upon the mystical valley from where a train full of Northern soldiers rolled, heading southward, carrying all of them and Seth to fight for the Union. It was not an uncommon practice during the early years of the war to become volunteered for service unknowingly or otherwise. It sometimes happened. Seth, awakening to the sound made by the twisting iron of the boxcar, sent him into a panic for a second of time. Then he sorely gathered himself. "What in the hell is going on?" he yelled out of fright and being heard by the other soldiers. "You're going to come to war, son, somewhere south." One of the older soldiers responded loudly over the noises of the straining metal from the train's iron parts before another one spoke up briefly. "Yeah, the Civil War calls for us all," he seemingly boasted to the others abroad. One man silently shook his muzzle-loading rifle into the air as a salute to the earlier man's statement, yet only a silhouette of it appeared to Seth's eyes from within the darkness of the damp train. He was soaking wet and angry, while still trying to figure out what had happened to him. Then he figured it out. He had been kidnapped to fight in the war for the North Side, the Yanks. "How did I get here?" he asked one of the older men present, preferring to get a straight answer. "Oh, we took you away. You see little Carl over there? He carried you in his arms like a little babe all the way down to the trestle from near your place where we loaded you up." The conductor of the train had been told to make frequent soldier pickup stops. "I guess the captain likes the way you outback fellas can shoot a rifle, and he wants to put you in his elite squad as a sharpshooter soon enough." "You mean I don't have to have a choice whether or not to fight in the war?" "Not you, and oh, I wouldn't be missing any targets for the captain. He will not like that at all. He might see it as an act of treason. He's not very understanding about things like that, believe me." "Yeah, I'm listening to you," he growled. "Back in Indian country, he beat a man half to death in front of a crowd because he wouldn't wear his military uniform properly. It really ticked him off. He's mean, and these guys will back his play, so watch out, young man," the old-timer advised to him. He thought about it all for a moment, and then expressed his remorse by saying, "Damn it to hell," he bolstered out loudly, and then quickly began to gather his thoughts. What about Anna and her well-being? For her well-being, He could only wonder what might become of her until he might someday return to his stepfather's cabin, maybe to discover something more about her. She must be wondering about me now. This is a tragedy, he considered. Then he remembered Goth, his stepfather. Suddenly there was a scuffling above the ceiling, on the ceiling of the rail car, where two men fell inside the rolling box car and onto the filthy floor by first shimmering down along both sides of the doorway cavity, seeming as if they had been professionally trained to do so. It was Bob and little Ermine. He recognized them both by their ridiculous voices and tendency towards calamity. They were much like kinfolk to him, neighbors as well. Both Royal boys had grown up thinking that one of them was brought onto God's green earth to live as a werewolf, and it was Ermine, or little Ermine. Whomever convinced them of this idea, he had no knowledge, but he knew that both boys were sincere with this idea. Seth had watched both Bob and little Ermine grow up to become strong young men, and he cared for both of them. Why they ended up here on this train, he pondered, while they fumbled around in the dark before gaining some night vision. "Hey, Seth! Seth, it's me, Seth!" "I'm over here, fellas," he said, then lit a wooden match for them to see. "Come on over, let's talk," he delightfully said. Others followed along behind them as the whole bunch approached him. He was scribbling in the moonlight, lost inside some of his writings from his personal journal, and he hesitantly stopped as they looked down at him. The voice from one of them was loud enough to penetrate through the rattling caused by the train. "What's your name, sir?" the young man asked in somewhat humble way. "My name is Seth, and what is yours?" was his friendly reply to the tall soldier. "Sir, my name is Sir Dave, but you can just call me Sir." "All of us thought you looked somewhat bewildered, maybe even confused, so we came over to talk with you, as maybe there is something that we can discuss. You know, we are all going to war, and you'll be fighting on my side at Gettysburg." "Who's the other fellows?" he asked, and then pointed at them with his finger. "You'll have to ask them," Seth stated. "That is my hairy brother, Ermine. He is my age practically." "We are stepbrothers," Bob spoke up. "He looks different than most other people aside from being extremely hairy. He looks like he could get mean very easily." The second soldier, John, spoke up and then silenced again. "Oh, yes," Ermine replied, and then looked strangely at the others. "He's a good fighter, and he is fearless, as you'll soon see at the front." "Ermine likes plenty of excitement in his life, and once he gets started, it's impossible to stop him without first there being a lot of bloodshed. Believe me, I have scars to prove it," he said, and then mistakenly revealed them. "Hey, Ermine, are you a fighter or a big coward? You look almost like a hairy mutt to me," the second soldier boldly yelled out, sending his words across the boxcar. Ermine was innocently watching the passing landscape from the threshold of the car door, just passing time, when suddenly he became provoked, and his ears quickly moved a little backwards, showing some definite movement backwards and reverse. I knew something was going to go down. "Your brother is a freak of nature," the smart-mouthed soldier injected another sentence to compound the level of anger building, and foolishly trained his eyes back on me with a sense of coldness inside them. Erman then rose back onto his feet and approached the talking men from the rear. Turn around and look at Erman the Freak. He is right behind you now, fellows, Bob said with a tone of sarcasm carrying in his voice. Erman had changed slightly, and his wolfen form had transformed him slightly into a beast with cold yellow eyes as he moved directly behind the wise guy soldier in only an instant. Sir Dave did not believe that Erman had relocated so quickly behind them, yet he turned out of fear. I spoke to them and the other, more silent soldiers as they all gathered into the eyes of Erman and death as well. Gentlemen, you shouldn't anger Erman like that, I said. It's not healthy. For any of us here in this boxcar, don't you know? I honestly spoke to all of them while they listened intently to me. By now, every soldier was watching them, the show go down. I think that Dave should jump out of the train right now and catch another ride, Erman declared. Who agrees? I asked the whole troop inside the train car, and the majority raised their hands. Some of them even spoke up, saying, Throw him out, get him out of here, they said. Well, it's agreed then, sir. You're just not welcome here anymore, and you're just going to have to leave us, Erman boldly declared. What? I ain't jumping out of this train for nobody, not even you, and your wolf brother, Dave stated while staring at the angry crowd of men. It happened much too quickly for David, and I think he must have been mortally shocked because Erman lifted him over his very hairy head and then threw him head first into the gravel shelf that lined the sides of the railway track of the existing territory. I quickly looked out of the doorway, only to watch the dead man's broken body fall over the cliff edge, falling to the bottom for the buzzards to feast upon. Erman felt pleased after killing Dave, and I have to admit that I admired him for standing up to Dave, even though the others in the troop had become fearful of us and unfriendly because of the incident. The men were acting strangely as the sun fell from the evening sky and left a blanket of darkness to fill the void. Now only starlight penetrated the darkness beset from the new moon. It was cold inside the boxcar, especially after the killing of David. His silent friend had managed to crawl into a metal shell, which made matters worse, but the other men paid him little mind as he lingered in the shadows of the boxcar's far corner. He was without direction because he had managed to lose his leader, and there was no one to guide him along. It was as if his mind had been taken to a leave. I felt absolutely nothing for him. As the evening proceeded, the men fell asleep one by one, and eventually their fears of Erman and Bob had given way to drowsiness and exhaustion, but there was some talk throughout the night as some of the men refused to rest. Oftentimes they spoke of a place in Virginia called Manassas, and General Irwin McDowell was to be the leader there. Outside Manassas Junction was to be our destination, I supposed, but I wasn't going to be there. I thought that for sure. The sound of the scathed-hardened rail beams carved a new image into my thoughts, metal to metal, the heat of fire charring into some steel, and certain opinions were set forth from my shortened experience with the soldiers and their brutal behavior towards one another. These men, both young and old, possessed a true nature towards killing each other. and they were driven by loyalties far beyond myself. What foolishness, I thought. Killing has never been hard for me. But with the reason, these fellows needed none, so I judged. It was at that very moment that I decided I would never become a soldier for the sake of killing. I needed more of a purpose to end another's life than mere hatred by which now had grown inside of me. My abhorrence for some of the others more cruel than my friends, the Boyle boys, were suddenly grew into a passionate frenzy as the air inside the train car suddenly grew thin. I could feel the hot breath of 10 or more bloodthirsty men with rifles and bayonets attached, encircling us three invaders. Lord help us, I quickly thought, as fear invaded my mind. Erman, wake up. They're coming to kill us. Erman, wake up. They're coming to kill us. I yelled loudly again as the sound of my voice was swallowed up by the creaking batten boards of the loaded boxcar. He moaned until I swiftly kicked him in the ribs, and then he responded instantly by growling, and then suddenly rising to his feet as the pack of men encircled us ever nearer. Finally, his voice perceived their gathering and sensed the danger immediately. He roared ever louder until every sound was flattened. Yet the soldiers kept gathering to come in on us. Erman lashed out at them with his claws as he was starting to change into a werewolf form, it seemed. His hair even seemed to grow ever longer, and his body was beginning to sweat and contort. He would have killed them all right there in the train if I would have let him go on with it. But for a moment, he still had partial senses left, and I encouraged him to jump from the rolling train by gathering his hand and yelling to him. Come on, I said, and Bob followed. Come on, brother, he screamed. All three of us jumped out of the rolling boxcar, delving into the dark night and unknown territories, somewhere west of the Potomac River. I lost grip from Erman's hand during the flight from the portal of the boxcar, and my awareness soon followed, as the cheeks of a full-grown ass cushioned my fall. Ee-haw! Ee-haw! The ass bellowed out loudly, overtaking the sound of the forbidden rolling train wheels. Ah-ha! Ee-haw! It resounded with ever more anger. I'd flown through the air and hit squarely onto the rump of a full-grown ass, and now was sprawled over still its rear end, partly clinging to the rear ankle of the excited mongrel. It bucked wildly to clear its rear quarters, and soon I was in mid-air once again, traveling head over heels until finally gravity arched my flight, bringing me down to earth, quite wounded, dazed, and horrified. Now facing me was the animal that my flight had frightfully violated. Fortunate for me that he was wiser than most others, since he had become quite forgiving, to say the least, as he stared me down anyway, albeit through confused eyes. I carried my body with tired persistence and in utter physical agony towards an abandoned buckboard that had earlier come into view. I immediately fell onto the moist earth until consciousness left my mind and darkness prevailed. I had two unlikely experiences that night, neither will I ever forget. One of a train and the other of a mule. It was my finest hour, as calmness eventually filled the green meadow where I lay underneath a shabby old wagon. But a troublesome rainstorm was brewing overhead in the heavens, and of this I was not knowing. The mule went back to feeding upon the grasses in the glen that allowed for a small farmhouse at the rise, and a few other features belonging only to mankind, and not really to the earth, but belonging only to an era. Lightning developed as the mule turned ever more into the storm's direction while eating more grasses from the ground. Electricity became more intense as it smeared through the low-lying and darkened clouds that were churning like water inside a boiling teapot. The mule looked upward, feeling like a captured piece of salt inside a homemade ice cream maker. His laying mat of hair turned upwards. By now, he had forgotten all about the rude man that tried to ride him so keenly. His concern was for the tumultuous skies and the soon to be helter skelter that was also soon to become his fate. He quickly withdrew to the heights of the glen, where he hugged a large sycamore tree root nearby the old shanty. Crack! A bolt of lightning erupted from above and escaped down to the ground instantly, sending a resound many miles far and away from there. Then another charge of sizzling, high-speed electricity began or was pulled out of the meadowland, ripping chunks of earth as it traveled upwards to reach its destination, and upon its arrival, the sky lit up like a magnificent candle that had suddenly been torched. The rusty old wagon that now draped a perfect handbrake had often rested in the meadow undisturbed, but now it teetered back and forth to the power of many treacherous winds. The age-old steel of its frame, often becoming quite shiny by resembling quicksilver under the full light of a noonday sun, as the flowing juices of the molten sky illuminated its rusted parts from above and literally from below, as sizzling beads of quantum matter burned trails of scorched brown to the once green grasses. Yee-haw! Yee-haw! The mule sounded again, out from underneath the knotted tree, as he totally disfavored the storms coming in. Yet the rain did come against his favor, thereby invading the puffy cloud filled hollow with sounds like tick 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 and on as droplets of rain fell upon the broken twigs and dried foliage that once lived there. Moisture saturated the air and became cool humidity that rose to an extreme level, as even a dropped rifle pouch would echo for a much longer distance. Ah, my head, I mumbled, while barely waking up to the covering of the rain as it rose up around me. Get to the top of this thing, it'll float, I uttered in a weak breath, while desperately trying to look over and afar, but could not see a thing through the rain. Only the ground nearby could I see as it suddenly disappeared into a shell of glistening clear water. It was not long, and all of the meadow, from the sycamore down to the wagon, was carrying more than its portion of water as I hung to the side of the steel contraption, because it was my safe haven for dear life. My leather moccasins were bloated with water, providing for a heavy pull in the fast-moving, flowing current, yet my clothing was smooth. Logs of tremendous size began to appear in the water, coming from the split much higher in the stream as the flood grew in size, but my hands held firm to the wagon side. I can't do this much longer, I had to yelp, but desperately I held on to the cart, and suddenly there was a sound so close behind me that the volume nearly wasted my ears. It came from behind in the stream. Hee-haw! Hee-haw! I quickly turned my head around to see, but there was no time for it because the mule, using his unbridled head, desperately lifted me out of the rushing water, lifting me up and over the side of it, and finally pushed me onto the top of the floating wagon, just in time to save my life from a passing timber that caught the poor mule by his back leg into a leaf-congested branch, drowning him mercilessly. Only a pool of air bubbles remained that quickly dispersed into the flood, where there once was a living creature, a true hero. The Glen will surely miss him, I thought, while looking back as I stayed atop the floating wagon and meandered with it to wherever the gushing flood waters were going to take me, my wretched soul, as surely the swell would drain into some other greater waterway, or so I hoped.